Thank you so much. That was a really lovely introduction, and it's such an honour to be here and to be part of this series. I really appreciate it. I want to say special thanks to Professors Luis Lafonia-Rosa, Professor Marco Abel, and Roland Begshaw for this invitation. Oh, and also Professor Jeanette Eileen-Jones, who's on leave, for bringing me here, for inviting me here, and a really special thanks to Vanya Villanak for all the unseen labour of organisation and logistics, which, as we all know, is a lot of labour. So as Louise said, I'm going to be talking to you today from a new project, so I look forward to your comments. At once mobile, at once enclosed, the plantation is a site where histories of dispossession, histories of colonialism, and histories of slavery converge. If industrial modernity is most often visualized by the environmental degradation and architectural assembly of the factory, that emblem of capitalism, then its other or even underside is the plantation, a space where species life is commodified, extracted, and discarded. Now, the plantation's paradoxical status as both enclosed and mobile reinforces its centrality to the understanding the processes and effects of the migratory flows of people, objects, and capital, whose circuits continue to structure and sustain our lives today. As a site of these histories of forced migration, a site of the production of racial capitalism, the plantation is also a site that migrated, connecting geographies across the Indian, Pacific, and Atlantic Oceans. And indeed, my own interest in the plantation has grown out of my immigrant histories that Louise described. I grew up in Sri Lanka and Australia, where the history of empire is so tangible, even though the plantation histories of these nations are less acknowledged. And these are just some pictures, tourist pictures of plantations in the central highlands of Sri Lanka, and the sort of houses or estates that you could now buy in these areas. And this is an image of a map, I'll talk about it a little bit later, of a pastoral estate, which was essentially a plantation in southwestern Australia that existed very close to where my family home is now, just across that estuary. That's the view from my parents' backyard. Really kind of confronting these histories, I've been, thanks to the work of people like Hazel Carby and Jamaica Kincaid, I've really been trying to grapple with and consider what it means to see with and yet against these colonial visual economies. We're seeing in so many ways today just how these extractive logics continue to shape our relationship to space and to each other. From medicine to politics, life remains disposable. The natural world, people, merely resources. However, it's also in these very same places where the afterlives of the plantation continue that artists have been returning to these histories in thoughtful ways to imagine other ways of engaging with land, with each other, and with history. Their return to the plantation reminds us of its continued significance, but also directs us to the different forms through which it endures, informing our historical imaginaries, our relationships to labour, to aesthetics, to the environment, to medicine, and to each other. This artistic turn to the plantations in the Americas, but also beyond, is often framed as a form of repair by these artists. And in the work of three artists in particular, working in Barbados, that's Annalie Davis, in Sri Lanka and Australia, we see, we see how these plantation histories really shape their personal and familial lives. And I will talk more about these three artists towards the end of my talk. But what I've found in talking with them and reading about their work is that in attending to the presence of the plantation, this process is also, in their words, a means to attend to both its violent legacies and a means of beginning a kind of healing process. Located in these different spaces, their work is also really often in conversation with each other, not just in terms of the histories with which they work, but also in terms of their practices of using art as a form of world building. Further, their contemporary attention to plantation histories is, I would suggest, a way in which we can start to see the plantation otherwise, as a site of rupture, most certainly, but also as a site of relationality, to reference Edward Clisson. The plantation, particularly in colonial imagery, is premised on a form of oversight that enacts a form of containment. However, these artists, in the way that this figure, right, in Ingrid Pollard's series, looks sort of knowingly out of the frame, like she's looking sideways. These artists too, I think, ask us to look sideways. They draw attention to the ways the plantation as both a landscape, a physical landscape, and a form of visual representation literally connected different geographies. But as their work is premised on this practice of repair, they also draw attention to the plantation's multiple identities, to the ways it came into view through and facilitated the convergence of overlapping meanings about space and its uses. So inspired by these artists, my talk, which is a little bit experimental and follows their line of vision. What I want to do is reflect on this idea of the relationality of the plantation, first by tracing its connections to different parts of the former British Empire, and secondly by demonstrating how this idea also helps us to see the ways that the plantation literally comes into view, how it takes form through the convergence of multiple forms of seeing, describing, and knowing. In particular, the overlap of the pictorial conventions, with histories of medicine. So what I want to emphasize really in this talk is sightlines, right? And moving between historical imagery and contemporary art, I want to ask a couple of questions. First of all, what do we see differently when we think about the plantation as something mobile in form? And what kinds of frameworks emerge when we consider the plantation as a site formed from the entanglements or intimacies, as Lisa Lowe describes, of disparate registers of knowing and seeing people and places? Now, in art history, the movement of form is often valorized as a way to deconstruct our field's national geographical teleologies. So terms like migrant aesthetics are increasingly important as scholars and artists challenge the enclosure of national boundaries to emphasize the relationality of, or the dialogic nature of artistic and material cultural production. But as someone who studies Black diaspora art and colonial visual culture, as someone who is an immigrant, the term migrant aesthetics also has another meaning, right? It calls to mind these circulations and networks that are inherent to histories of colonialism and slavery, and the violence of aesthetic forms that have emerged from these global processes. So sketching out this relationality today is not an attempt to reinscribe these networks, but in following the sightlines opened up by these artists, Annalie, Hanusha, and Jasmine, it's an attempt to see differently. It's an attempt to engage with the implications of this migratory form and the experiences of its migratory communities by exploring how meanings, experiences, and knowledge production converged and accumulated both within but also outside the logic of extraction that sustained the plantation landscape. So this early map by plantation owner Richard Lygon, I think, can help to demonstrate one aspect of the plantation as connective and a connected space. It's produced in the 17th century, just as the British were beginning their colonial expansion and development of sugar industries in the region. And it's really, I think, really interesting to think about what you notice in this kind of plantation map. Here, the plantation and colony are essentially conflated, reflecting actually the word's etymology in English colonial sources as synonymous with colony. So plantations and colonies were essentially the same thing at a certain point. Both are defined as property, And we see, obviously, these multiple interactions of human and non-human life. What we also see is the island is bordered by the names of these plantation-owning families. And yet these very names, which sort of enclose the island, also direct us to look beyond it, to look back to London, demonstrating how the plantation is always connected to a wider network or system of production. Now, in art history, we often use juxtaposition. If there are any art history students here, you know what I'm talking about, right? The kind of perennial art history slide lecture. The juxtaposition of two objects next to each other, and this is how we try and draw out visual comparisons and connections and trace the way things move. So if we did that here, we could put this map, for example, next to this group portrait of the family of Sir William Young, who was the first British governor of Dominica. We could see here in this relationship, right, between a group portrait theme and this map, the way that the plantation, its extracted logic, its profits, its economic returns, not only collapse the distance between Britain and its colonies, but is also embedded, literally sustains cultural production and British history itself. So I want us to hold on to this sort of sidelong view, this way of seeing things in conversation or in dialogue as I continue this talk. Because as we move into the 18th and 19th century, particularly to the 19th, we know, thanks to the work of scholars like Krista Thompson, that the plantation also comes into view in the Atlantic world primarily through genres of the picturesque and its relationship to the tropics. Now, the tropics was a term used to describe colonial spaces that were potentially vastly wealthy, but they were believed to be threatening or dangerous because of their climate, their environment, their ecology. And so the picturesque is an important form of landscape representation that intervenes in these discourses. The picturesque is, first of all, a theory of landscape representation that's developed by William Gilpin, and it's ultimately concerned with improvement through modification. It's a visual formulation that aims to enhance, to draw out the pictorial qualities of a scene, and it was really supposed to help an artist move beyond imitation, to create a picture in accordance with principles of taste and philosophical theories. So this generally meant adding embellishments, variety, manipulating scale, but it also meant being able to synthesize seemingly disparate forms, right, to create something that looked like a picture. So, for example, in Robertson's painting of his patron William Beckford's Summerlee plantation estates in Jamaica, you'll notice the overflowing basket augments the scene's lush bounty. It's both decorative and it sort of signals the domesticated nature of this space. He also includes two diminutive black figures, their poses referencing the supplicant kneeling slave with abolitionist imagery, and allegorical renderings of the female body, such as the three graces. They are, like the basket, ornamental, included to accentuate the gifts, the fertility, the availability of the land being viewed here. Now, such pictorial additions not only enhanced the appeal of nature, they visualized a method of seeing and relating to it. To see with and through the picturesque was to penetrate the truths of nature, while also controlling and adapting the natural environment. So the picturesque was a genre that relied on visual ordering, and it became a frame of reference that also united disparate regions of the British Empire. It was incredibly adaptable, it was capacious, and it was used by travelling artists across the empire. The picturesque modified local geographies into something recognizable. It created a view that emphasized immediacy and spontaneity, emphasizing control and oversight. And so my point here really is that plantation imagery also forms part of this wider network of landscape representation in the British Empire through this genre of the picturesque. So in that sense, I also think of the plantation, and this is a print of George Robertson's views on the island of Jamaica. He actually made several prints of Beckford's estate. So, the plantation is really in conversation with these sort of colonial landscapes that are also modified into ordered scenes. And in this modification, in this sense of, in the creation of a kind of visual control or oversight, I think of these scenes too as depicting a kind of plantation imaginary. They're emphasizing a particular orientation to ecologies of space and people as resource, as manageable, allowing viewers a way to visualize and then presumably cultivate a relationship to space and to the people who lived there that is ultimately extractive in nature. So I would emphasize this connection between the picturesque plantation and these picturesque scenes because it also foregrounds the ways that the plantation migrates to these other spaces too. If any of you have read Amitav Ghosh's trilogy, Sea of Poppies, you'll find there a beautiful and haunting account of the ways that indentureship connected the Atlantic, particularly following the end of slavery, emancipation in the Caribbean, and how it connects the Atlantic, the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Indentureship was a system of bonded labor that continued forms of labor extraction, refined through slavery. So as I said earlier, in Australia, for example, from the 1830s, capital from India and the Caribbean, from Caribbean plantations, along with indentured laborers from South Asia, and you'll see here the location of the coolie's house. So these are South Asian laborers who were brought over. This capital, this movement of people was also really significant to the development of the country's pastoral system, which is another form of plantation or plantation management that also relied on the clearance. Right? We don't see Noongar people in this map because they have literally been cleared from the land. So the pastoral system really relied on a form of clearance and also the forced labour of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people along with indentured labourers. Meanwhile, and so this is just some recent newspaper accounts of this history, which remains fairly marginalised in Australia. Meanwhile, capital and former plantation owners from the US South were also crucial to the development of sugar plantations in Australia's tropical northwest in Queensland in the second half of the 19th century. Former slave ships were used in the enslavement of South Sea Islander people, kidnapped or deceived into travelling from Pacific Islands to work these plantations. And in setting up these systems in Australia, administrators were looking very closely at the principles of labour and labour management inculcated on the Caribbean plantations. In Sri Lanka too, British administrators needed to usurp the small-scale agricultural production of local Sinhalese farmers in the central regions of the country, introducing what was known as, and I'm quoting, the West Indian method of cultivation in the 1830s. They also imported indentured Tamil workers from the Madras Presidency in India under exploitative conditions. As these larger-scale plantations grew, again, the model of labour management, punishment and architecture was directly modelled on the Caribbean. So let's now return to the plantation as it takes form in the British colonies of the Caribbean, without losing sight of these other visual dialogues to which I'll return. What I want to emphasise here is how the cultivation of islands like Barbados and Jamaica from the 17th century, so from Ligon's map to Haynes's map, in this movement, plantation, we see how plantation spaces were forms of landscaping that translated aesthetic theory into spatial practice. As a form of landscape modification, as I said, the picturesque revolved around observation and synthesis, It offered a space to look closely while remaining detached. So in Robertson's work, we follow this cleared path through the overgrowth. Through contrast in shading and rhyming forms, Robertson also enhances or improves the natural surrounds of his patron's estate by accentuating its exotic aspects, its timelessness, and in this way signalling the possibilities for its management. In William Berryman's watercolour, we look over the tree fronds in front of us, and these of course are plants that were brought from other parts of the world as subsistence crops. And we view the plantation's architecture, signalling its domestication of the natural world. People, plants, and architecture from across the world here are unified into this sweeping vista, into a domesticated scene of seemingly natural beauty. So in different ways, right, Robertson clears a path, Berryman allows us to soar over the land. Both of these artists are offering a sort of unobstructed visual access to these spaces, showing them as ready for use. Now the emphasis on seeing clearly that is sort of associated with the picturesque becomes particularly important when we look at the way landscape theories become incorporated into late 18th and early 19th century medical topographies. These medical topographies essentially mapped what was thought to be diseased environments across the British Empire. They relied on surveying and charting and describing the physical features of a place that were presumed to influence health and disease. Now, as the plantation economy grew in the Caribbean, the large number of deaths of Africans and Europeans from a range of illnesses really led to a mapping of disease onto the islands. And Emily Senior has shown how in these sort of descriptive accounts by British medical officers and poets in the Caribbean, they used a very detailed description to reinforce this aesthetic vantage point of the picturesque. They observed with a transcendent eye, creating a vantage point from which they were able to aestheticize these islands, but also distance themselves from the potentially harmful diseased landscape. So this vantage point gives them a kind of colonial immunity. But as they move closer, they start to make these diseases more visible in the land, forming what Emily Senior calls an environmental diagnosis. Essentially, they're diagnosing the healthfulness of the natural world. Now, these descriptive accounts were also attempts to contain the threat of illnesses, the threat of illness and disease that was associated with the tropics, through the idea of improvement to the land. And so, of course, one such improvement that was associated with this topographical management emerges with the plantation itself. So, reading the plantation through these medical topographies, we can start to see how the plantation, which is already visualized as a form of landscape improvement, could now be understood as something almost beneficial, a physical improvement of the land through the practices of clearing that it required. The transformation of the Caribbean into a plantation industrial complex could only take place through the dispossession and genocide of indigenous communities, deforestation, the clearing of undergrowth and burning of roots. And these practices continued in other parts of the world. And just for an example, you can see this is a photograph of a coffee plantation in Sri Lanka, and you can sort of see that deforestation take place in the background. And just as the picturesque landscape offered a clear view of the plantation, land cleared, literally ready for agricultural management, allowed plantation owners closer access to their property. They could see their property more clearly. So as a cleared space, the plantation, at least in its imagined form, could also offer this illusion of a land that was clear of disease and the illusion of the possibility of disease prevention. Now, these medical topographies that were shaped by the plantation also connect the Caribbean to Sri Lanka and Australia in other ways. The plantation system's expansion in Sri Lanka was similarly couched in these discussions about the relationship, right, between disease and geography, particularly because these plantations were formed and were instantiated in these very forested regions of the central provinces, which were thought to be pathogenic spaces. You know, a conception that also dovetailed at the time with ideas about these deadly jungles which should be cleared. So you'll notice, for example, so in this print, right, there's a sort of change in density as we move from the undulating ground to the atmospheric clouds. And the miasmic theories of disease that were circulating by medical officials at the time, in these theories, the air of this area was also understood to be a principal carrier of disease. And so it wasn't just the ground that could be studied here, but also the weather, like the atmosphere itself. In this way, the plantation in the Sri Lankan highlands really becomes a site of bureaucratic management as government officials use plantation sites to collect information about land, climate, as well as the local and indentured populations. This data was used and was needed as it's described in colonial sources, to better manage these vectors of disease causation and to better manage local populations through this narrative of sort of colonial benevolence. The anxiety over diseased workers led to the building of plantation hospitals, the clearing of roads and paths between plantations, so that indentured labourers could be better surveilled through these new technologies of care. In a similar way to the Caribbean then, the plantation as an environmental intervention and space of observation overlapped with these regimes of control that colonists really believed were needed to transform these pathogenic regions into manageable spaces. I think this is reinforced in some way in the fact that this image of the Sri Lankan plantation presents us with this clear view and this ordered landscape, but also suggests a kind of before and after view. The plantation is nestled within mountainous geography rather than being overpowered by it. And what's interesting about how these sorts of images start to shape medicalized thinking about space is that by this time, by the 1850s and the 1860s, these plantation regions and these kinds of images were used to visualize the island itself as a place of effective colonial management, and actually as a site of respite, a place where British visitors could travel to enhance their healthfulness and their wellness. I mean, it's quite strikingly similar to the way Sri Lankans talked about today. And this is just a couple of examples, right? So now it's no longer coffee, but it's the tea plantations that remain a visible symbol of this country's picturesque appeal, while also reinforcing the political and ethnic difference of the Tamil communities who labour on it. In a different way, we can see how colonial topography shapes conceptions of Australia as well. This is a depiction of Wadandi Buja or Kumbana Bay, again close to my family's home. And we're seeing here a land that's imagined to be emptied of its original owners. It's under control, it's settled, it's carefully managed. And I just wanted to kind of make a note of the way we're again sort of able to sort of fly through the air, but also the emphasis on the trees, the kind of the warm sunlight glow. It was Western Australia's warm climate and its natural flora, particularly the eucalyptus, that actually allowed it to be constructed as another kind of respite from the sort of diseased, pathogenic tropics of South Asia, particularly India. So here, we see that this, I think in many ways, this image really reinforces those narratives, right, about this state's healthfulness, about its benefits. It's a place for colonists, especially from the South Asian tropics, and they sort of wanted to entice former British military to settle and be safe away from those disease spaces. So I'm just highlighting these medical topographies here because they really, again, demonstrate another set of dialogues that connect plantation spaces, but they also demonstrate how the plantation was itself a relational space, a space that was imagined and visualized through the convergence of art, medicine, and profit. What the plantation offered for owners, for medical professionals, and for artists was visual acuity, a way of seeing clearly, but also staying detached. And it was through its physical organization that it made these sightlines of observation possible. Sightlines along which the aesthetics of landscape representation, the development of medical knowledge, and economic return all converged. But what's interesting, right, is that in order to actually glean artistic or medical information material from the plantation, we're required to move into a far more intimate interaction with the landscape and the people who worked it. It required essentially working on the ground. And so bioprospecting, for example, is one way in which artists and medical professionals, again, try to survey, order, manage the natural world. Yet in moving closer to it, they were mostly reliant on the knowledge and healing work of Indigenous and enslaved communities. And this is just a plantation manual that talks about enslaved and Indigenous uses of flora from the area. So they were mostly reliant on this knowledge, but of course this knowledge often goes unacknowledged in these kinds of texts, essentially replicating the workings of the plantation itself. But just as the natural world became a resource for extraction, so too did the lives of those who worked on the plantation. As Deirdre Cooper-Owens has shown, and other historians such as Rana Hogarth, enslaved people became teachable material, people whose bodies offered learning opportunities to newly arrived European doctors. Doctors like James Thompson, for example, travelled to the Caribbean. I just want to point, so this is the Plantation Hospital, which is an important site of that reinforced the kind of management and control of the plantation. These are these sort of medical treatises. Also, take form within that kind of framework of control in a similar way to what I described in Plantation in Sri Lanka. Doctors like James Thompson, who travelled to the Caribbean, describes how he found the plantation to be an active site of learning and experimentation where new diseases and unfamiliar bodies could be observed. Thompson was particularly interested in testing the efficacy of inoculation against smallpox and a particularly painful bacterial disease called yaws. And he publishes these 4 small drawings in the Edinburgh Medical and Surgical Journal that depict an experiment he undertook on the body of a 3-year-old child. And I apologize for the violence of these images. He took discharge from the ulcers of an enslaved child with yaws and inserted it into several punctures he had made in the healthy body of a 3-year-old. And in these images and in the accompanying description, he offers an account of the disease's pathology. The young child, who may not have otherwise caught the disease, took 9 months to recover. But of course, we don't hear about the child in the drawings. What we can see here is Thompson attempting a kind of microscopic view. Right? He's focusing us in on body parts, trying to reveal what takes place beneath the surface. The young child is visualized as a specimen as we lose sight of the whole for the part. And we are compelled in this process, as attending observers, to examine and potentially diagnose ourselves, right, by reading the surface of the skin. So just as the plantation was a site of physical control, here we're seeing how it becomes a site of medical control, as forms of data were extricated from people and plants through close observation and diagnosis. And of course, these forms of knowledge provided officials with another kind of transcendent colonial imaginary. They formed, articles like this formed part of a circulating network of medical information that sustained those associations of geography and disease that I discussed earlier. And were used to strengthen measures of oversight and control implemented across colonial geographies. For example, when the problem of laws really emerges in Sri Lanka towards the end of the 19th century, Thompson's work is quoted, right, in these colonial reports. So they're still in play even several decades later. So I emphasize these connections to demonstrate how these prints and images mediated a medicalized vision that not only reproduced, but really also ultimately emerged from the kind of oversight, those sightlines that are made possible on the picturesque plantation. Now, the negotiation of this microscopic and macroscopic view is also made visible in an engraving made for the physician John A. Waller when he's traveling through Barbados. Now, Waller may have even brought a portable microscope with him when he traveled to the Caribbean, because in this print, I'm interested in how he sort of toggled between the close-up details of the plantation and the expanded oversight of the plantation as a whole, which is encoded in particular by the plantation house at the top there. Both of these sorts of views offer us an empirical viewpoint, right, that reveal different aspects of plantation life. While we're able to observe and take on multiple viewing positions at once, I think Waller's unique sectioning of the quarters of this enslaved community, creating a sort of relief-like view of the interior of this small house, and the awkward positioning of the figures in profile at the foreground, suggests something of the paradoxical relationship that's embedded in these medical and aesthetic attempts to bring things into view and ultimately keep them at a distance. Waller's print, taking us onto the ground, in a sense brings us into a closer proximity with other kinds of life on the plantation, taking us perhaps into what Sylvia Winter has called the plot, those parcels of land, and we saw them earlier in the Benjamin Haynes print as well, on which enslaved people could grow their own food, feed themselves, thereby minimizing a planter's costs. The plot in Winter's terms might signify a site of subsistence where knowledge and plants could grow and be used and shared. And I'm interested in this way in which forms of knowledge, right, outside the kind of frameworks of Western medicine might have been shared and used. And so here, I'm just interested in thinking for a minute about what might be the ceramic ware that's included in this scene, and how this might bring us to some of the material traces of practices of nourishment and healing, forms of community creation and activation that existed within but also beyond the extractive regimes of the plantation. Pots and vessels were used in different kinds of healing practices. And I think it's interesting to sort of speculate on perhaps what we might be seeing here. In practical terms, the plot might have also been the ground on which enslaved healers learned about the healing cures of the local flora. Perhaps they grew their own and taught each other. Emerging from the extractive logic of the plantation, the plot nevertheless existed outside of it as a space where transplanted enslaved people could nurture and cultivate cosmologies through subsistence. But the plot also suggests forms of reciprocity and an orientation towards space that can perhaps move us away from the transactional relations of the plantation and its promise of return. And these plot histories and this idea of reciprocity that they evoke between human and non-human life also animates the work of Annalee Davis, who examines the post-plantation landscape of Barbados. Her work centres on a former dairy farm, which actually was once a sugarcane plantation, and it's the farm on which she now lives. In her conceptualization of space in her works, she really focuses on the soil or the ground as a site of embodied knowledge, of memories and meanings shared. For her, the soil is a conduit that connects enslaved communities to the brutalities of plantation management, while revealing the worlds they shared with plant and non-human organisms. She draws on the concept of phytoremediation, which is literally the process by which certain plants are able to detoxify water and land, and she turns to these plant histories, addressing the agricultural and social degradation created by the plantation economy, while creating new grounds for healing. So in this work, for example, Bush Tea Plot, she created this glass planter that allowed viewers to see the soil profile of a specially curated plot where plants with medicinal properties were grown. She also provided, as you can see, viewers with digital tools so they could learn more, gain more information about the soil and the plants that she's using. In this work, Bush Tea Services, which comes from the series called Sweeping the Field, Annalie repurposes shards of pottery, which she finds on these plantation sites. And she finds them as she's walking, and that she goes walking every day. And so it's sort of a practice of hers to look and to sort of reuse what she finds. So she repurposes these shards of pottery into a tea set, which you can sort of see here, in which she serves sweetened, right, a reference to the sugarcane, sweetened bush tea that are brewed from plants harvested in these former plantations. Honouring the women and men who planted, used and cared for each other with these bush medicines, this piece literally returns us to the soil itself. And you can see she actually served this tea to audience viewers. She literally returns us to the soil itself, refiguring the grounds of the plantation from a space of controlled oversight into a site of restoration that begins from the ground up. Davis's work recalibrates our position from observer to something like witness, directing our attention to these practices of healing, of survivance and refusal, working on a visual scale that moves us from a perspective of looking over to being in the land itself. And I think this also comes from her practice of walking. She creates the grounds from which to imagine different modes of care for each other and the land that emerge from these plantation histories but are unable to be contained by them. I think we see a similar orientation in the work of Hanusha Somasundaram, for whom she's a Tamil artist whose family are tea pickers in the hill country of Sri Lanka. And as I mentioned earlier, if anything, Sri Lanka's plantation histories really continue to shape the nation's representation in the popular imaginary, while essentially erasing the lived experience of Tamil communities who work on the land. The hypervisibility of Tamil workers, particularly of Tamil women, stands as a really profound contrast to their continued social and political alienation in the country. They're basically unable to participate in the kind of national body politic on many levels. These acts of erasure underpin Hanusha's work. She was born and raised on a tea plantation. Watching these processes unfold around her, Hanusha really emphasizes how her artwork is, in fact, the result of plantation labor. But she's paying homage there to her parents and her grandparents, whose plantation wages literally paid for her art education. She also uses the instruments of tea drinking to connect the past and the present, as if here the sort of liquidity of the beverage itself becomes the conduit that links the corporeality of her family's labour to the viewer, to the tea drinker, and to Hanusha herself. Now, Hanusha is particularly focused on the experience of Tamil women who labour in multiple ways on the plantation and who face severe health risks often as they labour. So in Stain 2, she includes these different scenes from plantation life, a pregnant woman, a creche window with saris hanging down, to cradle the sleeping children, women surrounded by tea leaves and wave slips. And next to each is a tea bag label with words that respond to the scene on the cups. The label, for example, the label attached to the pregnant woman says pregnant woman, labour, risk, income, why. So she's sort of really kind of drawing the viewer into to question these practices. Like Annalee, Hanusha is really interested in using these practices of consumption, the literal ways that tea mediates conversation, to structure her own dialogue with us. And she extends this evocation of physicality by writing and drawing on tea stainers so that the act of pouring tea can literally bring to light the bodies of tea pickers and the conditions they face. She explains this in an interview where she says, our tea everyone knows, but when they drink their tea, they do not know who makes it. And yet here she is. The taste of Ceylon tea is not human. In Silent Struggle, she uses wage slips as architectural plans of the plantation to highlight the imbalance between the value of labour and the production of profit. Again, a reminder of the racial capitalism that sustains national histories at the cost of lives. Hanusha's work is significant to me, not least because this is where I'm from, but because, like Annalee, she's working from within the plantation, using this site of trauma from which to begin repairing the wounds of its erasure. Central to her work, really, is this paradox of how the plantation and its representation offered ways of controlling Tamil lives, and the ways its representation now really obscures these histories altogether, these experiences. For Hanusha, then, centralising her family's story becomes the means to bypass these lines of sight and create space for communities' histories and their expressions of life, joy, and connection. Similarly, the emphasis on the material, the ephemeral, and the commodity descales these viewpoints of control, taking us to the everyday acts, the experiences, the physicality of labour, experiences of plantation life otherwise hidden from view. In this sense, too, I think both Hanusha and Annalee move us beyond the kind of ocular centricism of the colonial imagery I've described. Instead, they're calling up and relying on other registers of meaning, other frequencies, to quote Tina Camp, right? Embodied knowledge, sound, the kind of experience of conversation, the experience of touch, reminding us really of the limits of vision alone as a way of addressing these colonial histories and legacies. Now, bringing what is hidden from view into public memory is also central to the work of the artist I want to conclude with, Jasmine Togo Brisby. Now, Jasmine is a fourth-generation Australian South Sea Islander woman who grew up in Queensland, and her practice also expands from her family history. So Jasmine's great-great-grandparents were taken from Vanuatu as children, and as I said earlier, the history of their enslavement has not only been sidelined in Australian history, it was sort of doubly negated by the fact that, by the government's deportation of these South Sea Island labourers back to the Pacific Islands in the early 1900s, after the passage of the White Australia policy. So today, however, their descendants have finally been recognised as a distinct cultural group, and this was done in 1994. They were recognised by the Australian government as a unique minority group. So Jasmine's sculpture, Bittersweet, from 2015, really deals with this history, this sort of double history of erasure. A pile of skulls cast in unrefined sugar, again a reference to the commodity, and resin glistened under the gallery lights, slowly giving off a sickly sweet smell. The work was prompted for her by the discovery of an unmarked mass grave of these Australian South Sea Islander labourers on a former plantation in Queensland. For her, that grave was a profound metaphor for the literal silencing of her family's histories, of her community's histories in the public sphere. It's also a metaphor for the loss experienced by Australian South Sea Islander communities whose culture and language were stolen when they were kidnapped and brought across the sea. So in Bittersweet, Jasmine creates space for mourning, while powerfully materializing the profound oppression, dislocation, and familial trauma passed down through generations that continues to sustain the inheritance of wealth, right, created by the sugar industry and its colonial histories in Australia. Like Hanusha and like Annalee, Jasmine's also using her artwork as a form of witness. She activates these familial memories to destabilize the official record. As she told me, we can't move into the future without knowing our past. And here, in another series called The Past is Ahead, Don't Look Back, she uses a collodion process to emulate 19th century photographic practices, literally allowing her to step into the archive. In this act of animation, she also produces a space of coexistence where she can stand with her ancestors, with the ones she has lost. And Jasmine has described to me how the plantation histories of the Americas and the ways that artists from the US and the Caribbean who have turned to this history have really inspired her and essentially provided her with a language for beginning to work through her own family narratives, particularly when their stories remain so erased in Australia. These three artists, then, working in disparate geographies, are connected by these colonial histories, instantiated by the plantation. But their work also calls up another plantation imaginary, in which different modes of relation, alternate orientations, and even new remedies emerge as a means of forging new solidarities and envisioning new futures together. Thank you.
We have some time for questions. We'll run to you with the microphone, yes.
Hi, Anna. Thank you for your talk. I'm wondering, I'm really curious about some of the earlier illustrations. So in the South, as you know, so much of the plantation was tied to hospitality. And so you see that in the 21st century renderings of how the plantation has been kind of retroversed, so it's about a pleasurable experience. And so I'm wondering, in those earlier sketches, have you found anything kind of tied to hospitality, but also the plantation space as a kind of a space of maladies? It seems to be very curative in nature. But what about the opposite of that? I'm just curious in terms of some of the earlier etchings and illustrations.
Yes. Did you mean the ones with that showed the hospital and the maps?
Yeah, but just any in general.
Yeah, no, I haven't. That's a really great point. Particularly also given that Annalee's working with this idea of hospitality. So thank you for reminding me of that. I haven't. I've just come up what I've found in the imagery and in those texts. Is really about the plantation as a site of malady and disease and sort of, but the doctor that I mentioned, James Thompson, in the front of in the introduction to his book, because he also writes a book about race and skin, which you probably read it, but but what I really intrigued by is how he describes the kind of abundance of opportunity in the plantation, but it's all premised on disease. I haven't yet found anything that really talks about or evokes that sense of hospitality, but I mean, it's something to look for. I mean, even Waller, he's just interested in sort of microscoping in sort of seeing how enslaved communities function, but he doesn't really talk about not, and in many ways actually it's the opposite. When he's describing that plantation, it's a sort of not just the side of disease, but also the kind of the strangeness of the land, and so yeah. Sorry, I'll keep looking though.
Questions? I had a question about the last artists and how they're reusing this form of the plantation. Is this the example what you were thinking about migrant aesthetics that you mentioned at the beginning? Because I feel that the plantation as a form, yes, it's a form, it's an aesthetics too, that unites the tropical world through the empires, right? Unites you and me, right, from Puerto Rico. And these artists that you're studying are sort of repurposing that form, right? Not like the hotel where people from the north can go and have a good time, right? There's a repurposing. But there's also another history, starting maybe with the Haitian Revolution, of just destroying this form, right? Of doing away with it, not repurposing, but just burn it to the ground, right? So I just wanted to ask you, how is that you see what these three fascinating artists at the end are doing? Would this be the example of the migrant forms, right? Or is the plantation the example of the forms of enclosure? Is this, what would destruction mean, an art of destruction here? Well, maybe the previous one has with the skulls, right?
Yeah.
There's some of that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Just in terms of migrant forms, I guess I was thinking about in multiple ways. So both the kind of, both the sense that the plantation here is the form that's moving, and I could have shown photographs from Jamaica at the same time with the exact same kind of, so that again, that's sort of that visual formation that moves. But here I was also thinking about the way that Jasmine is working between temporality and in that sense sort of dismantling or destabilizing that sense of enclosure by moving between time. And I think this one is probably in terms of your question about the destruction. Yeah, I think this one because it's so literally formed from the materiality of the materiality of the commodity. I think there's a sense in which this one's doing more of that work of destruction of. Literally, I think of that vertical formation, like literally pushing up and kind of, exploding out. I think you're right, though, it's very interesting that I don't think any of them really are thinking about kind of burning it down. And in a way, the plantation is almost the sort of beginning to create something else, and then rather than actually, doing that kind of that sort of destruction that maybe other artists like I guess maybe Kara Walker is sort of doing something different. But for Jasmine, it's interesting because she's just finished a new series actually, and she's gone to a plantation in a town called Mackay, which is in North Queensland, and so she really talks about it as a kind of memorial site, you know, for her, sort of where she's able to find links to these family members who are sort of erased. You know. So I think there's an interesting tension there too in terms of how they're working.
Questions? Well, I think if there are no questions, we can continue the conversation informally. It's a long semester, so thank you, Anna, so much for this presentation, and that's it.